to our Guilds of Ravnica set review. We're going to start with Izzet. This is going to be a breakdown of the entire Izzet guild and any non-watermarked cards that we feel like belong best in the Izzet guild for this set. Our rating system is an A is a bomb. This is a card that's going to win you most of your games. It pulls you actively towards that color and it makes you excited to play the deck. A B is a tilting point. So these are your solid removal cards, your cards that will win you many games, but they're not going to take over the game on their own every time. When you're torn between different colors, these are the cards you want to run. When you have multiple in your deck, you feel really good about your pool. A C is your consistency cards. These are the cards that are going to fill up the majority of your deck. If most of your deck is C's and very few D's, you feel really good about it. Where our D's are the weaker versions of C's. These are cards that will fill your curve, but they're not very efficient. Even when they do the job, their job isn't effective. And these will also be your build-arounds, but in this case, these will be build-arounds that can work pretty well if you successfully build around your deck. But without that combo, these cards are poor. And then your F are your cards that you don't want to run. They're very poor. Your build-arounds that even when they work are very narrow and they are not consistent enough. Or sideboard cards that you'll board in, such as Artifact and Enchantment. Starting off, we're always going to start with a card that has the key mechanic for that guild. And we're going to start with, let's see if we can get this right, Quasi-Duplicate. Quasi-Duplicate. Yep, that's a card. So it's 1 blue for a sorcery. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control. And it has a jumpstart mechanic. So our jumpstart mechanic for the rest of this explanation is you may discard a card from your graveyard and from your hand, and then play this card from your graveyard by paying its mana cost and then exile it. So it's kind of flashback, but instead of having alternate costs on your flashback, it's the same as its original cost. You just have to discard a card. Jumpstart as a whole, I think is going to be a pretty effective mechanic. I don't think a lot of the cards that have Jumpstart are necessarily very good, but I think there's a few that will make impacts in constructed formats. The idea that you get to filter away a land later makes it really strong. Now in this card, because it is a sorcery and because it targets, I give this card a D+. Unless you have a really amazing creature, you can't copy an opponent's creature. This is a sorcery speed. It does target, so your opponent can interrupt it. Unlike clones, where they enter the battlefield as copies, you're able to enter the battlefield as something. They can just make it a negated spell by removal. So I don't think this card's necessarily great, but if you have 1 or 2 really good creatures, this could be effective. Ral, Izzet Viceroy, is 3 blue-red planeswalker, comes with 5 loyalty, is +1, and he's designed very similar to Teferi. +1 is look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 of them in your hand and the other in your graveyard, so some advantage. -3, Ral, Izzet Viceroy, deals damage to target creature equal to the total number of instant and sorcery cards you own in exile and in your graveyard. So this doesn't punish you for jumpstarting your spells. And then his -8 is you get an emblem that's a mixture of a couple different emblems we had previously. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, this emblem deals 4 damage to any target, and you draw 2 cards. So it fuels itself for getting more triggers. I think Ral is really strong. I actually think he's going to make some standard impacts. He does have a -3 that protects himself when you build around it. He has a +1 that gives you card advantage, and he has an ultimate that's going to single-handedly win the game if you can reach that ultimate. Now in Limited, he's going to be a little bit weaker. But the Izzet guild does seem very heavily pushed towards spells, even in the limited format. There's not a lot of impressive creatures, but there's a lot of spells that have overall long-term effects, and a lot of the creatures really do depend on spells. So they're trying to push you away from the traditional setup of 3 to 6 spells in your deck when you play blue-red. You really want more spells in your deck. I give him a B+. I think if you get him in your pool, you really want to build to use him. So you want to make sure you got enough spells that he can remove something with his -3, and you're really trying to protect him to get that ultimate. I don't think he's going to win a lot of games by himself because he's very poor at protecting himself, so you need to have a board state to get in the way. Niv-Mizzet Perron is a 3 red, 3 blue legendary dragon. This spell can't be countered. It's a 5/5 flyer, and whenever you draw a card, you get to deal 1 damage to any target. Whenever a player casts an instant sorcery spell, you get to draw a card. So this card's really going to effectively protect itself, or at least replace itself. So whenever it gets targeted with a removal spell, it'll trigger, you draw a card and deal 1 damage. So even if they immediately kill it, it replaces itself, but it is fairly hard to cast. And limited, triple blue, triple red on turn 6 might not be the most consistent thing unless you have multiple guilds or some of the signets. So you need to make sure, or I guess lockets. So you need to make sure that you are playing this card with the understanding it's not going to typically come down on turn 6. But I think this card can take over the game. I think it's an A-. You really want to play it, but you just want to make sure that your mana is fairly evenly distributed and that you are keeping an eye on your mana count as you are drawing and deciding on mulligans. If you have a hand with a bunch of islands and no mountains, you probably want to mulligan because it's important to be able to play this as fast as possible if you draw it. League Guildmage is a blue and a red for a 2/2. You can pay 4 and tap it to draw a card, which is a fairly decent ability in the long game if you can stall out the game. And you can pay X and a red to copy target instant sorcery spell with mana cost X. So you can pay 3 mana to copy a 2 mana spell. I think this card is a little greedy for the guild mages. I don't think it's one of the better guild mages. The draw a card effect is really good in the long game, but you're going to see throughout this video that it's really hard for Izzet to go to the long game. I give this card a B- because when it is working, when it is clicking, it's really efficient. It is a card that you want in your Izzet deck because you're going to be playing a lot of spells. I'm just concerned about the Izzet guild as a whole and how well it's going to get there. Expansion and Explosion is hybrid blue-red, hybrid blue-red for copying target instant sorcery spell with your mana cost 4 or less. And you choose new copies, so you can basically copy a spell. And Explosion is X, blue, blue, red, red. So it's got 4 and then X to deal X damage to any target and draw X cards. I think this card is decent. I give it a D. I think it's better and constructed when you're really building around the explosion aspect or the expansion aspect. You can copy counter spells to counter spells. Explosion is a great mana sink later in the game, but the problem is, do you really want to count on Explosion towards the end of the game? Because in order to deal very much damage, you're taking 4 off whatever your X effect is, so you really have to survive till way late in the game for Explosion to do much. Crackling Drake is double blue, double red, flying. Crackling Drake's power is equal to the number of instant sorcery cards you own in exile and in your graveyard. So again, another card that doesn't mind you exiling spells with Jumpstart. It's a really good design that they made sure to keep that in mind. And then whenever it enters battlefield, it replaces itself by drawing a card. I think this card's a C+, just because the mana cost is a little bit difficult. Also because spells is not traditionally something you want to run a lot of. Now, in playout, this card might actually be a B, because the Izzet deck might be forced to play spells because of the effects of their creatures. That being said, traditionally, you're not running a bunch of spells in your decks, so it's going to be really hard for me to see this card being in a deck that's actually efficient. What it wants to do is what's traditionally not very strong in Limited, which is playing a bunch of spells and few creatures. Izzet Locket is 3 mana Locket that produces a blue or red, and you can pay 4 hybrid mana to sacrifice and draw 2 cards. I give it a B. It doesn't have a ton of mana sinks in the Izzet guild, and it will have enough card advantage through the jump starts and the draw spells. You don't really necessarily need the draw 2. If you have 1 or 2, you will run 1 or both. But I think in the long term, it's not going to be as impactful as, say, a Golgari or Selesnya Locket. Invert and Invent. They've already errated this card. Blue-red hybrid, switch the power and toughness of each of up to 2 target creatures. So you don't switch them back and forth. If you have a 0-4 and a 2-2, you make it a 4-0 and a 2-2, and it just is till the end of turn. So they errated that to be end of turn, even though the card didn't include that. And then you have a 6 mana instant, search your library for an instant and or sorcery card, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. I think this card's pretty decent. It will act as a fairly decent removal spell a lot of the time, flipping a big creature's power and toughness, and then letting your creature trade with it. The invent effect is pretty strong. I do give it a D because I'm, again, not really wanting a deck where I'm leaning on the spells too hard. I want some creatures that are going to win me there, so I'm not sure that the invent's exactly what we want out of it. And the invent's going to be really situational. So this is a card that I think has a lot of upside, but it's one of the ones that's really situational on when it's going to be effective. 1,000-Year Storm is 4 blue-red enchantment. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, copy it for each other instant and sorcery spell you've cast before it this turn. You may choose new targets. This is a D, but this would be one of your Ds that's a build around. If you are in a Izzet almost all spells deck, this card can be amazing. There is a fair amount of artifact enchantment hate, especially in Selesnya, so you have to keep an eye out for that. But if you're able to resolve this card and you can start casting 2 or 3 instants or sorceries in one turn, this card can really take over a game. So it's a D, but it's a D because it's a build around. Whenever you get a deck that it works in, it might be in the B range, but a lot of decks it won't work very efficiently in, and you'll end up not wanting to play it. Firemind's Research is a blue-red. This is another Spells Matter card. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, put a charge counter on it. Pay 2, remove 2 charge counters from Firemind's Research, draw a card. Pay 2, remove 5 counters from Firemind's Research, and it deals 5 damage to any target. Adding 5 counters to this thing in Limited seems like it's going to be very difficult to do, so really you're going to be using it to draw a card. But this card coming down in the late game seems just terrible. I give it a D. It's probably closer to an F. I don't know if it's going to be very effective. If you're in the all spells deck, this one might work, but again, we're having a lot of cards where spells matter, and those don't traditionally win the game. Ionize is a 1 blue-red counter target spell. It deals 2 damage to that spell's controller. I give this a C. Cancel effects are normally not the most impressive thing in Limited. They're not what you exactly want to be doing all the time. So I think it's decent, but I don't think it's world-changing. You don't always run cancel in your blue decks in Limited. I think you'll need to if you're playing the spells version of Izzet, which is I think might be the only version of Izzet you can play. But 2 damage doesn't matter enough for me to be really excited about paying a cancel that costs 3. Risk factor, this is a 2 and a red instant. I'm more excited for constructed play on this one. I think it's a pretty cool design. It is a punish effect, and punish effects are where your opponent gets to decide. So they normally are going to choose the effect that is least bad for them. So either they can take 4 damage, or if they don't take 4 damage, you draw 3 cards. And it does have Jumpstart. I give this a C-. You're probably going to play it, but unless it's towards the end of the game, they're almost always going to just take the 4 damage so you don't get card advantage. So you really want to be casting this card when they're at 10 or 8 life and force them to choose between going to 4 to 6 or letting you draw 3 cards, which is what you're going to really need to win the game. So that's where this card's going to shine. That's why in constructing, I think it's going to go pretty well in very aggressive lists, but it's not exactly a control card. Beacon Bolt is a sorcery, 1 blue-red. Beacon Bolt deals damage to target creature equal to the number of instant sorcery cards you own in exile in your graveyard with Jumpstart. So again, yet another card that's really dependent on playing a bunch of spells, and we have to look through to see how many of these spells are very impactful in the format. I give it a C. In the deck that you want it in, it's going to be good, but it's a matter of whether or not you have enough instant sorceries that are worth playing to make this card efficient. Beam Splitter Mage is a blue and a red. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell that targets only Beam Splitter Mage, if you control one or more other creatures, that spell could target. Choose one of those creatures and copy that spell. Then you can choose new targets. So you don't necessarily have to target the other creature, but you can copy it and target Beam Splitter again or target something else. So this is a C. I think the card is basically just a Grizzly Bear that will very occasionally have an extra effect to double up one of your Jumpstart pump spells or haste or flying effects to give another creature similar effect. Chemist's Insight, I think this card's very excited, especially for constructed. It is 3 and a blue, draw 2 cards, and Jumpstart. So we're going to see 2 cards that are blue that have Jumpstart and they draw cards. I think these are going to be really effective for any Reanimator type of decks that pop up into Standard, because if you can self-mill them, you can use the Jumpstart effect to put a reanimation target into your graveyard. I think this card's a C+. I think it's going to be really decent in constructed, and I think it's going to be very good in limited. We Dragonauts, this is a classic 1 blue-red flying fairy wizard. So it's important to remember it's a wizard form if you're looking at constructed wizard decks. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, We Dragonauts gets +2/+0 until the end of turn. So as you've heard many times before, the Izzet are very dependent on a lot of spells. They are not really giving you a choice to make a spells deck. If you're Izzet, you're probably a spells deck. So with that being in mind, this card is a B-. It's a card that you need to have at least one, hopefully more, in your Izzet sealed deck in order for it to be effective. Direct Current is a 1 red sorcery. Direct Current deals 2 damage to any target, and it has Jumpstart. I think this card is pretty decent. I think it's a decent effect. I would much rather have seen it come out as an instant, because as a sorcery, it's not really a great answer. It normally trades down by killing 2 drops. But the ability later in the game to kill a 4-drop by paying 6 mana is okay. So I think the card's a C. It's one you want to see a couple of them in your deck, but it's not exactly exciting. Goblin Electromancer, another reprint. It's a blue-red. He's a goblin wizard, also a wizard to keep in mind. Instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and he's a 2/2. He's a C+, because, again, our Izzet deck wants us to be playing spells, obviously. That's the way that the guild has been designed for this set. So if we're going to be playing a bunch of spells, I want to play them for cheaper. Gravatic Punch is 3 and a red sorcery. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target player with Jumpstart. So if I can play 1 or 2 big creatures, just big generic red creatures, this card can really push through to hit your opponent by letting you play it twice. I think this card is a C-. It really is dependent on the creatures you have, but it is a card that you might need to play just to act as a burn spell to push through damage. You just need to make sure that you're not getting your creature removed, because it is a target. So if you cast it and they have open mana and they kill your creature, you get nothing. Hypothesizzle is 3 blue-red. This is an instant. You draw 2 cards. Then you may discard a non-land card. When you do, Hypothesizzle deals 4 damage to target creature. So it's 5 mana instant, draw 2. If you choose to discard a non-land, you can deal 4 damage. So you can turn it into a removal spell. So if you have another Jumpstart card, you can pitch that to deal 4. Or if you have a card that's dead or just not being very efficient, you can discard that to deal 4. If you don't have anything worth discarding, you just pay this for 5 mana to draw 2 cards. I think it's a C+, just because it has the option of being a removal spell. But again, I'm not incredibly impressed with 5 mana for 4 damage to a creature. But I do get some card advantage out of it. Maximize Altitude is a blue sorcery. Target creature gets +1/+1 and gets flying until the end of turn. And it has Jumpstart. I think this is a C. If I'm playing Izzet, I'm probably going to be playing this card. I'm probably going to play multiple copies of this card because I need to be playing a bunch of spells. But I want spells that give my creatures evasion. I want spells that are cheap and that have value. So this card's going to help me push through damage, but it's not a card I'm exactly excited. If I'm playing this and my opponent's playing some strong Golgari or Selesnya cards, I feel like I'm playing worse cards. So I'm needing to set myself up in positions. It's looking like a guild where you have to really set yourself up to win games. Maximize Velocity is a red sorcery. Target creature gets +1/+1 and gains haste till the end of turn, also with Jumpstart. I give this one a D. I'm not as excited for this one for limited or constructed purposes because I've never been a big fan of a idea that I give away a card to give haste. I don't think that's an effect that's really necessarily always very good. And limited, there's a lot of blockers kept back. And constructed, there's a lot of removal. So the idea of paying a mana just to give haste and a small pump doesn't really make me feel good about having that card in my deck. Piston Fist Cyclops is a 1 blue-red hybrid. It has a defender. As long as you've cast an instant sorcery spell this turn, it can attack as though it didn't have defender. I give it a C-. Again, I need to be in this spells deck. So if my hand is empty and I have this card in play, it's just a fairly poor wall because 3 toughness isn't very great. But it does have the ability to take over a game. But again, 3 toughness, it's going to be trading fairly often. Radical Idea, I think this card's going to make great impacts in Standard. And it could even make impacts in Modern. Is 1 in a blue instant, draw a card. And for the Jumpstart, you can discard a card to pay 2 mana and draw another card. Again, I think the Jumpstart effect is really powerful, not from the fact that you're getting this semi-flashback, but the ability to put specific cards in your graveyard for reanimation or other targets. I think that card's going to be very strong. I think this is C+ in limited, and I think it's actually stronger in constructed. Sonic Assault is a 1 blue-red, tap target creature. Sonic Assault deals 2 damage to that creature's controller with Jumpstart. So I can pay 6 mana to tap 2 things and deal 4 damage to them. I think this is a D. It doesn't freeze the creature, it just temporarily taps it. It's going to be efficient if I have some flyers I'm trying to get through, but depending on the ability for my deck to punch through, I'm not exactly sure how effective this is, especially if my opponents are on Selesnya with a bunch of tokens. If I don't have a flyer, they'll be able to set up chump blocks forever. So just dealing 2 damage for 3 mana basically is not something I'm entirely excited about. Vidalcan Mesmerist is a 1 in a blue. It's a 2/1. Whenever it comes into play, target creature under controls gets -2/-0. I think this is a C+. The 1 toughness is unfortunate, but it's going to be fairly important for you to be able to punch through damage by shrinking one of their creatures. Wall of Mist is a 1 in a blue. We've seen this one before. It's a defender. It's a 0/5. I think it's a D. I don't like playing defenders very much in limited. They really don't advance me, but if I'm playing an Izzet deck that's got a really strong late game of spells, maybe I want it. But if I'm in a deck where I feel like playing this is important, I'm not incredibly excited. Wishcoin Crab is a 3 in a blue. It's a 2/5 with no text. I give it a D. It doesn't do anything. It blocks okay, but I'm not really looking for a guy that can block. I want to have cards that are going to help me win the game because I'm having to play a lot of spells that aren't always the best just to enable some of my top end. So I need my other creatures to be able to hit. Muse Drake is a 3 in a blue for a flying. When it enters the battlefield, you get a draw card. I think this card's a C. 1 power flying isn't necessarily very good, especially for 4. But the fact that it replaces itself is decent, and it's going to be able to chop away at some of the non-flying opponents for 1 for a couple turns, and I just need to get a little bit of damage through in the air and then use my spells to leverage wins. Leapfrog is 2 in a blue. Leapfrog has flying as long as you've cast an instant or sorcery spell, and this is a 3/1. So I think this card might be decent if I'm in the spells turn. I give it a D+, because if I am in the spells deck, this card is a 3 mana, 3 power flyer. So if they don't have another flyer, it's going to be getting through for a lot of damage. Again, I still have to see how the spells play out because so far a lot of the spells haven't been incredibly impressive. Capture Sphere is 3 in a blue. It's a flash enchantment aura. Keep in mind there is a lot of enchantment hate. When Capture Sphere enters the battlefield, tap target creature and tap enchanted creature. Enchanted creature does not tap during its owner's step. So I think this card's a B. I think it's really efficient removal. It's probably some of the best removal we have in the Izzet deck or any blue deck for that matter. But again, keep in mind that there is a fair amount of enchantment hate in the other Selesnya and Boros and Golgari lists. Remembering Mystic, I think this card's really powerful. It's 3 in a blue for a 1/5, so it blocks fairly well. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you make a 1/1 blue illusion bird with flying. So I think this card's going to be how these spell decks take over. You really want to see like 2 or 3 of this card in your limited deck. If you're having 1, that's okay. But if you can get 2, that makes you feel a lot better about playing all these spells. I think it's a B. It's going to be how you take over by just making an army of 1/1 flyers. Omnispell Adept. I'm more excited for this from Constructed. It's a 4 in a blue for a 3/4 human wizard. Pay 2 in a blue and tap it. You can cast an instant sorcery spell from your hand without paying its mana cost. I give this a C-. In limited, there's not a ton of spells I'm excited to cast from it, but it's still normally going to save me some mana. I'm more excited from this from a constructed perspective. Being able to cast Apex of Power, Nexus of Fate, or Overflowing Insight for 3 mana is something that seems incredibly powerful. Arclight Phoenix is 3 and a blue. It's a flying haste Phoenix. It's a 3/2. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've cast 3 or more instant and sorcery spells this turn, you can return from the graveyard to the battlefield. So you're really looking to hit them for 3 and hopefully rebuy this card once. It's going to be hard to cast 3 spells in a turn twice in the game and still be getting there. So I'm really expecting this card to be rebought once. That said, I still think it's a C+. It's still 3 damage out of nowhere in the air, and then potentially another 3 damage later. Erratic Cyclops is a 3 and a red. It's a 0/8 with trample. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, it gets a bonus power equal to the spell's converted mana cost. I think it's a D+. I think it's a build around, but if you're in the Izzet spells deck, I think this card's going to be how you win a lot of the games by just making this dude massive, and he is fairly decent at blocking until you're set up to play multiple spells. Experimental Frenzy is 3 and a red. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play the top card of your library. You can't play cards from your hand. You can pay 4 mana to destroy this thing if you get too many cards in hand. I think this is an F. I want to play draw spells. I want cards in my hand. I don't want to be playing one option off the top of my deck, so I'm not a very big fan of it. If I had a way to manipulate the top of my deck, pay some mana to exile the top card or something, maybe I'd be a little bit more interested, but the inability to do anything to the top of my deck means I'm kind of locked with whatever's on top. Runaway Steamkin is 1 and a red elemental. It's a 1/1 whenever you cast a red spell. If it has fewer than 3 counters on it, you can put a 1/1 counter on it. You can remove 3 1/1 counters to add 3 red mana. I think this is a B. From Limited, you want to play a very red heavy deck. This could probably go on your Boros list or your Izzet list. It can be turned into a really big creature and then generate value later on. But I'm really excited about this card in Constructed as just generating a ton of mana and a bunch of counters really quickly and pressuring your opponent as a 4/4. Book Devourer is a 5 and a red with trample. When it deals combat damage to a player, you may discard all the cards in your hand. If you do, draw that many cards. This card looks like a joke set card because of the picture. I actually think the card is a B-. I think it's pretty strong. 6 mana, 4/5 trample isn't the best, but the ability to Wheel of Fortune in your hand is pretty strong. Electrostatic Field is a 1 and a red. It has Defender, and this card is whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, Electrostatic Field deals 1 damage to each opponent. It's a 0/4. I'm a little bit more of a fan of this wall because it will slowly win you the game because you're looking at probably playing about 10 to 12 spells in order to make your Izzet deck churn. So I think the card is a C-. It could be better if you have multiple of these and you're really fully committed to the spell deck. Inescapable Blaze is 6 mana instant. It can't be countered. It deals 6 damage to any target. I think this card's really decent removal. It is very much a late game spell, but it's going to be really important versus the green matchups because their creatures get really large. So I give it a B+. It's just very effective removal. Lava Coil is probably some of the best red removal we've seen and is 1 in a red for a sorcery. It deals 4 damage to a target creature. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. I think that exile effect is very, very important, especially with the Undergrowth floating around in Golgari. So I give it a B+. It's very efficient removal. 2 mana for 4 damage is great. Smeltward Minotaur is 2 in a red. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, target creature and opponent controls can't block this turn. Again, this card's going to be very important when you're in the spells version of Izzet because you're really just trying to make sure that whatever you do have creature-wise can get through. I think it's a C. I think it's going to be a card that you definitely have to draw because it's going to be how you push through, especially against the Selesnya matchups. But it's also not something I'm excited to play because it means I'm having to play a bunch of spells, which not very many of them have looked very impressive. Command the Storm is 4 in a red. It deals 5 damage to target creature. It's an instant. So I think this card's good. 5 mana for 5 damage instant speed is very effective. It's not unconditional, but I think it's going to be able to kill most of the cards in the format, so I give it a B+. Cosmotronic Wave is 3 in a red. It deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. Creatures your opponents control can't block this turn. I give this a D. We're not really going wide, so we're not punishing them by not letting them block. It's really how we're just trying to push through a little bit of damage. 1 damage against the Selesnya list might kill a bunch of tokens, but against everything else doesn't do a whole lot. So it's not a card I'm incredibly excited to be playing in my deck. Fire Urchin is 1 in a red. It has trample. It's a 1/3. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, it gets +1/+0. So this can slowly get pumped up as you play multiple spells in a turn. I think it's a C+. It's the card you want in this Izzet spells list that they're making us run. Sure Strike is 1 in a red. We've seen this one before. It is a +3/+0, and it gains first strike until the end of turn for a target creature. I think it's a C. It's going to act as a removal spell. It's going to help you push through damage. It goes really well with our creatures that get pumped by playing spells, such as We Dragonaut, the Elemental Before, or the rare 0/8 Cyclops. So I think this is a card that you're going to want to run 1 or 2 of in your spells deck, maybe more because our spells are super important. I would have loved to have seen them test this build with 2 mana, less power, give First Strike, but also give it the flashback ability through Jumpstart, but it's still a good effect. So that's going to be the end of Izzet. As you can tell from a lot of the discussion, the guild is very much going to be dependent on you playing more spells than is traditional and limited. If you're fairly new to limited, I would probably recommend avoiding the Izzet guild. As much as it's one of my favorite guilds, it's going to be very difficult to build a winning deck that does not take a lot of work to win early on. Now, if you want to really challenge yourself and you're playing sealed, Izzet's a fun route to go to challenge yourself because it's going to take a lot of work to build a deck that's consistent. I think in draft, the Izzet guild gets a little bit better when you get multiple of the really good cards, because I don't think it's going to be contested very early on in the format, because a lot of people are going to avoid it because it has to play all these spells as opposed to creatures, and that's not traditionally a recipe for success in limited. So I think the guild is a guild that's going to be needed to be tested. I'm not sure if we can get a really good taste on the guild or really good feel of the guild until we've seen it in play. So I don't know if it's one that I would want to go with my pre-release. If I'm trying to win packs so I can play some more of this at home by winning packs during the pre-release before the set actually comes out. So I know I like to win my packs and draft with my friends, and I don't think Izzet's going to be the way that you win your packs. I personally think it's probably one of the weirder guilds and one of the more restricted guilds because that spell restriction is fairly large. But again, it seems like a fun one. If you really want to test your deck building ability and your play ability by setting yourself up for positions to win, this is going to be an excellent way to test yourself. So what do you think about the Izzet? Are you excited to play the Izzet? Do you think that they've captured the Izzet by forcing you to play all these crazy spells? And do you think there's certain cards in the Izzet guild that if you open them, immediately pull you to that guild despite the restrictions on the rest of the build? Or are you going a different path? Make sure that you like and subscribe to us on Twitter and on YouTube so you can get notifications. We still have to break down the Dimir, and we will have a land and artifact breakdown, as well as the full set overview of removal and the sets breakdowns by guild that will be coming out before the middle of the week, so you can be nice and prepared for your pre-release.
If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. It helps out a lot. Also, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with all of our uploads. You can follow us on these platforms here at MTG Deck Techs. And finally, a big shout out to Terry Ledford for his generous Patreon donation. If you would like to become a patron for MTG Deck Techs, please click the link down below. It is not necessary, but it helps us out quite a bit. Thank you for watching the video, and we will see you all again soon.